All
Yeah,
right. Well, I just started the recording, so we're gonna do some theory crafting here. Gonna talk through the slate. Um, my name is James McCool, joined with Pablo and Jason, and some other community members here if they want to ask questions later on. But we're gonna talk through NFL Week 3, go over some game theory, go over some decisions and stuff like that. But thank you for tuning in. Thanks for joining us in the Slate Talk, and let's go ahead and get started. So, Jason, I kind of want to start on that too high safety thing because it's a hot button right now, and you were saying that it's not quite as like prevalent as it seems.
yeah. So you're going to be very surprised when I say this that through 2 weeks of football data so far, there's only 9 teams that really have run a too high safety look more than 50% of the time. And those teams that have done it have, I guess you could say, have had success against lackluster offenses, and some of them have also gotten burned. One of them in particular that just really stands out is the Minnesota Vikings, and to me, that it's a pretty it's a pretty unique team to talk about in that game in total, just because Cam Akers obviously is going to be massive chalk, and deservedly so. It's kind of the cardinal rule: you never fade a really cheap running back who's going to get all the work. But what the Minnesota Vikings do, they play a too high safety man look 80% of the time, and they sit in a zone 79% of the time. Um, I think that what Brian Flores likes to do, and this is what a lot of the other analysts in the industry have said, is that they call him like this quote unquote mad scientist who likes to mix in all these coverages. He kind of forces you to play schoolyard football. And over the first 2 weeks, he had Daniel Jones, who obviously needs like the perfect conditions for him to succeed. And last week he had Brock Purdy, who, you know, without Christian McCaffrey, Debo gets a little banged up. He gave them problems last year. Now they're going against CJ Stroud. And I think a really unique leverage point is to just stack Houston. CJ Stroud is very good against every coverage that he's going to throw to him. He's a very good passer on the run. He's got one of the highest accuracy rates when he's outside the pocket. And CJ Stroud is kind of known for making plays out of nothing. So that's one thing that initially stuck out to me today is that one of the teams that is doing it more that you think would invite you to run the ball, they actually drop more into cover twos and cover fours to contain you. I think CJ Stroud could have a field day here. He's pricey, but I think him and his pass catching options can really go off here.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to think about the too high safety stuff, and like why it would actually matter, right? Because for DFS, we always talk about how like there's not really that much value in being able to predict the future. All that you're really trying to do is predict what other people are doing and beat them at what they're doing. So I try to think about things like the too high safety stuff and the defensive revolution, and whatever. I try to think about that stuff in terms of how does it actually affect my DFS play. And what I've landed on is that it really doesn't. In any effect, the way that a defensive scheme affects my DFS play is if it fundamentally changes the way that I am building projections, or if it fundamentally changes the way that ceilings are dictated by certain players. So, in something like NBA, if all of a sudden it was like impossible to make a 3-pointer, like they made it so the hoop would shrink if somebody took a 3-point shot, then projections would obviously reflect that, right? Like Steph Curry would no longer be a good play. These 3-and-D wings would never project well. Things like that. That would be a mechanical change. But for too high safeties, I'm not seeing a lot of evidence that it actually should change the way that I'm building out projections. So, and to your point, everybody's making this huge deal out of it. There are not really all that many teams who are forcing the issue on this. Because I found the same data, and the Vikings are the team that do it quite a bit, and I just haven't found a lot of reason to think that it's the main driver behind the lower scoring. What I've found to be the main driver in the lower scoring has simply been that there's a lot of bad offenses and not that many good quarterbacks. I mean, we have rookie quarterbacks and we have bad teams and we have bad offensive coordinators that are not putting together good offenses. So I, from a modeling perspective and from a DFS perspective, I have not found too much of a reason to care too much about it. I think that it's less important than understanding man and zone concepts because man coverage does lead to different things. Like I have a tool. I have a tool on the site that shows the difference in targets per route run between man and zone coverage, and there's some wide receivers and tight ends that are incredibly good against man and not good against zone, and vice versa. That matters a bit more. But this too high safety stuff, Pablo, I assume that you do not care at all about this stuff, but I'm interested to hear anyway.
Yeah, I mostly don't care at all. I care only to the extent that maybe somebody who is a ball watcher can tell me why somebody might be a sneakier play than otherwise I would realize. Aside from that, I'm mostly just going to take advantage of overconfidence in decision making that people make related to it. And I mean, as it relates specifically to Cam Akers, I think it's somewhat analogous to the quarterback decision this week, which is that I think the chalk cash build will be triple cheap running back with Cam Akers, Charbonnet, Jordan Mason. And I think for GPPs, you're probably paying up at least one of those spots instead of using one of the running backs to either a pay up wide receiver or a pay up running back. And then it's somewhat related to macro build theory for this week in that the cheaper guys like those three, predominantly those three, given how owned they'll be, will allow people to pay up for the more expensive quarterbacks in the form of either Jalen Hurts or Kyler Murray, although Kyler's not quite as expensive as Hurts. And so I know it's more macro, but one of the decisions I've been looking at, and it's related to the savings that going down from Hurts and or Murray to the cheaper guys like Carr, Darnold, predominantly for me, or if you believe in Geno stacks, if you into that, which interestingly is kind of a direct pivot off of Charbonnet. I think that I'm more interested in the game theory aspects of how the DFS players field are using their interpretation of schemes to make decisions leading to ownership and efficiency. And so how do I take advantage of that? More than I am confident that I can use any scheme analysis to make a good decision about who to play.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you, Pablo. And the one thing I will say about watching the data come in from week 1 to week 2 and seeing all this, like I know, James, we talked about how we both found the Vikings ran the most. As you look at, week 1, the Houston Texans ran the second most. Week 2, the Houston Texans ran at the third least amount in the entire league. And what I started to see, and I'm curious, I don't even know if you guys have looked this in depth into it. This may sound like I'm predicting the future, but really I'm not trying to. I've seen a lot of these teams really switch around their looks based upon the quarterback and team that they're playing. The Houston Texans, they start a lot of too high, sit in a lot of cover 3 and 4 against Anthony Richardson, try to contain the run, and they don't want to get beat with the deep ball. They still get beat. They play against Caleb Williams, rookie quarterback, no Keenan Allen. They up their man looks, they up their single high, and they try to get after him. I've seen that with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers too, right? Like week 1, Jane Daniels, they sit in a lot of cover 3, cover 4, and they man up their guys because they think he can't pass. And against the Lions, they almost abandon the man completely, right? So I think when you look at who these guys are playing, you can make an educated guess. But should you make that educated guess? I don't think it should be your end-all be-all. It should be a tiebreaker, if anything.
I think what you're describing about teams playing things differently week to week, in conjunction with the small sample size that we have, are two of the many, many examples you could choose to give evidence to why people making judgments about defensive fronts dictating likely output in their opponent in a given week being mostly a guess. And to me, again, it's mostly about how often are people overconfident in their guess and how do we take advantage of that. And I think we see it mostly through ownership is the best way to judge it, and combining just ownership and range of outcomes so that we can directly take advantage of the areas where people are most overconfident in either stacks or individual plays that are more fragile than they seem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to tie a knot on all of that, with the NFL, it would be one thing, and here's how you could actually utilize this kind of stuff to your point, Jason, of teams using different looks against different teams. If you had data that would create an expectation for what teams are likely to use what coverage types based on what the opposing offense runs the most, whereas it's team agnostic, but understands like what the team is likely to run, like more 3 wide receiver, more 2 wide receiver, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. If you have data that would show a correlation between those things, that would work. However, because the NFL is only 17 games and things change every offseason, that data is just unreliable. So all of this is just to say that I do think that it's an interesting talking point, but very similar to like things like BVP or other kind of tiebreaker metrics. I think that kind of stuff is more of just a tiebreaker thing. So I listened to The Bakery. It was really good. I have some thoughts on some of the things, but I think that one of the things that I have noticed about the slate, and I kind of said it when we were moving in, is that it feels a lot like last week, where, again, we have a lot of really good chalk, and how you play these really high-owned players is really going to be an important aspect here. Guys like Jordan Mason, projected for 37% owned. Cam Akers right now projected for about 29. Brandon Ayuk projected for about 29. I did boost in my most recent run the ownership for Jordan Mason and Cam Akers. I want to likely boost it more. I think Cam Akers probably about 35% when the cards turn over, and Jordan Mason probably about 50%, but I want to be a little bit more thoughtful. I don't want to just like do a blanket boost on that. So, but I think that there's a lot of really good chalk. I think that the medians for these guys and the different aggregate projections are kind of like speaking to that. But I think that whereas last week we didn't really have that many good pivots. I mean, we had a couple, but this week we have a lot of really good pivots.
Yeah, we do.
And you can kind of nail down in every single price range for basically every position a player that's less than 10% owned that you can utilize instead of a player that's 30% owned. Basically, the only player that I think is really, really hard to replicate is Brandon Ayuk. And I want to hear you guys' thoughts on Ayuk, but I'm having a hard time based on median, based on expected fantasy points, based on his ownership, based on everything. I'm having a really hard time figuring out how to get off of Ayuk for somebody else.
Yeah, I got to tell you, James, he's a very hard fade for me too. The reason why, and I'm going to give a few reasons outside of just the projections too. When you look at the Los Angeles Rams, they have some injuries on the defensive side of the ball. I know people are very worried about this team competing offensively, but the one thing that I've seen with the Rams, and even this is dating back to even last year, they like to sit in these like really, really soft zones, and they'll man up on short yardage downs. I just think that the way San Francisco plays, with the outside zone, zone run schemes and everything they like to do, they like to spread you out. I think outside of you thinking that Ayuk's going to get bracketed and double coveraged, or Purdy can't get him the ball for some reason, I don't see how you fade him. I actually think there's a little bit more credence to fading Jordan Mason than I do Ayuk. And I know all the numbers will tell you that, when these guys are out, like Ayuk has better numbers, but their offense suffers as a whole when one of their main options is out. There's also something to like winning targets and being, a quality receiver. Like, do we really think that like Chris Conley and Jawan Jennings are going to win all of these targets? Like, I don't think so. Um, I really like Ayuk. I'm having a hard time fading him also. I'm completely with you. Outside of just projections, just from a scheme and personnel perspective, who else is he gonna throw to that he's confident?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Pablo, Pablo, I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I do think it's largely a pricing thing for me. I mean, with his role and the injuries at 6,200, the alternatives, like you're saying, James, at that price point are lacking. I mean, you either have to figure out how to get up to like the Devontae Smith, Nico Collins, Marvin Harrison range, or you have to drop down to like Rashid Shaheed, who we all like, Tank Dell, who I think is a little more fragile than I made it sound on Bakery. And what's weird about this week is like there's not the one thing I think is weird about this week, given all the injuries, is that I don't think there's a tremendous amount of useful cheap wide receivers like below 4,500. Like there's like almost nobody really down there that I think for small field is a good play. For larger field, I think there's probably more options. But I think because of his price and role, he's a very strong play. I mean, I think if you wanted to poke holes in it, I think the only things you could say would be, is that game just potentially just going to be a boring game, like where they just feed Mason, the LA does nothing, and and Ayuk just doesn't get there because San Francisco can just play like a really boring game. He catches like 5 or 6 for 50, doesn't score a touchdown, right? I think that would be the biggest hole I would poke in it, is just game environment, as opposed to some of the better game environments I think we have on the slate.
It's also the perfect game to illustrate why, and shout out to Elite Break in the Discord. This game is the pure, personified reason of why you play more than one lineup, right? If you want to try and capture both of them, you can in different ways. I wouldn't play them together. I think all three of us agree with that. But I think that's really that's a really good reason why you should build for multiple scenarios across a set of lineups.
It's one thing that I just noticed as we were talking about this. Jordan Mason and Brendan Ayuk, both 6,200, both project for 19.5 fantasy points, both project for about 30% ownership. Like,
yeah,
they are mirrors of each other. And one thing that I do think is interesting with this, bringing up that point, I wrote in the thoughts and notes. I'm not quite done with that yet; it'll be out soon. But one thing that I noted is that I kind of did the same thing last week, where I looked at the Rams and I said, okay, I know that I want this team because I think they're going to score points. I know that Cooper Kupp is going to be massive chalk. I know that I want some Kyren Williams. So what I did was, in one lineup, I forced Kyren Williams in there, and then in another lineup, I forced a Ram stack so that I could spread out my volatility a little bit. It's kind of the same thing here, where I want to force a Jordan Mason lineup and then also on the other side force a San Francisco stack, but not have them together. And it's interesting because I do think that Jordan Mason is a really, really good play just in a vacuum, and I would be inclined to just lock him in again. I had him in all three of my lineups last week. I wouldn't mind doing it again this week, but I have so much interest in San Francisco stack that I think in at least one of my lineups I need to go with San Francisco stack so that I can spread that volatility a little bit. Another point with Jordan Mason and Brandon Ayuk is I do think that something a lot of people won't do is play them together without a stack. Like, if you think that this game is going to suck, but a team is going to win, probably, it's not going to be 0-0, there's no reason to think that it's completely out of the range of outcomes that Brandon Ayuk and Jordan Mason combine for like 210 of the 270 total yards for San Francisco. So even if they only score like 14 points and Brandon Ayuk has 6 catches for 110 yards and a touchdown, and Jordan Mason has 22 carries for 115 yards and a touchdown, like, they crush their prices, and San Francisco only scores 17 real life points or something and wins the game, right? I think that that's a completely reasonable way to go about this. You would be eating a
Yeah.
lot of ownership, but I don't think you'd be eating a lot of like relative ownership, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's I sometimes when there's a near lock free play, I almost feel like you just do it and then you don't really care if there's another player on his team. And if anything, you're kind of happy people won't play them together. I think it's a little less risky in small field where you don't need the absolute pure nuts to win. Whereas in larger field, there might be some inverse correlation between the two to some degree. Like the reason I don't feel that strongly about that is because of their price. Like if one of them was 7,500, the other one was 6,200, I would say, well, it's hard for both of them to get there. But both of them being 6,200 in a game they should dominate, like you said, I don't think it's that far fetched to see them both getting there at that price.
Yeah,
And again,
yeah.
in a situation where there aren't great pivots at that price range at wide receiver for Ayuk.
Yeah, I totally agree, and also, our contest sims really reflect that too. I just ran the sims before. Jordan Mason is popping, obviously, as the number one running back you need from an exposure standpoint in small field and large. Sorry, very very sharp fields, small fields. He's popping a lot, but like Aaron Jones as a pivot is a little bit behind him in a similar price range. When you go to wide receiver, it's like Chris Olave, who's going to be owned in his own right, and like that's really it around him in the price.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is the same scenario we talked about last week where we were talking about, I brought up the prospect of doing it with Debo and Mason. This week, it feels like you can do it. I know I said before, I don't want to play them together, but you can, just because you can make the case that there's no one else. Like you said, James, like they may account for 80% of the yards and all of the scoring. If you capture all that, they may beat everybody at their prices.
Well,
So I'm going to have to consider that small field.
Debo and Mason, they eat into each other. Like Debo is going to get rushing work. Debo is going to get rushing touchdowns.
Yeah.
Ayuk is not going to get rushing touchdowns. Like that, I don't think that there's hardly any negative correlation between these two. It would be different. Like I don't want to use like Purdy plus Mason plus Ayuk because Purdy and Mason are fundamentally like negative correlated. That's one thing, but the Debo and Mason thing that was completely different than this Ayuk and Mason one. I really do like the concept of Mason plus Ayuk, and I don't care in as many lineups as I need to do that. I don't think that I will do it in all of them, but I do like the concept.
Can I want to talk. I want to ask you, James and Jason, about two things. Number one, in the running back position, alternatives to the triple cheap running back build, meaning other running backs you can use outside of Charbonnet, Mason, and Akers, and then number two, I want to get your thoughts on how to approach alternative ways of using players in games that we like that will be creative instead of doing kind of the more standard approach that people will probably use these players in these games. So at running back, to your point before about how this week is a little bit different than last week, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, is that it does feel like there are just a myriad number of options at running back to pivot off of the cheaper guys. And I sort of just want to list some of them and get your thoughts because I think they're all interesting. I'll just go from expensive to cheaper on the guys I have currently in my player pool. I won't go through everybody, but because I just want to hit a few of them and get both of your thoughts. Saquon, I think, is very interesting given his role, his ceiling, game environment, and the fact that he'll be basically, I think, extremely unowned given everybody's going to be using either hurt stacks or if they're playing that game, they'll use Devontae Smith. And Alvin Kamara will be 2 to 3 times as owned on the opposite side. So Saquon, I think, is a very interesting pivot. Going down, Kyren Williams, I think, is a more contrarian play, given the the general belief that LA is just a really bad team and San Francisco might smoke them. James, I'll get your thoughts on that in a second, but I'm guessing it's largely usage related, and him being almost game script narrative agnostic in terms of his role and his usage. And I'm sort of purposefully skipping the own guys because I think I wanna get your guys' thoughts on the pivots, right? Gibbs, disappointing for the most part the first couple weeks. A little pricier, kind of an uncomfortable click at 6,800, but in a what seems to be tremendous game environment that could shoot out. I've been trying to figure out ways to hyper correlate that for small field. That game, it's burned me twice already this year trying to do that. But there will be a game at some point that is going to shoot out, and it'd be unsurprising for that game to be the one this week. On the other side of that game will be unowned. Same sort of feeling as Gibbs, although Connor has actually gotten there. Derrick Henry in a game that has a high total and will be leverage off of Lamar, who should be fairly owned. And for what it's worth, the ball watching crowd, like Evan Silva and our version of Evan Jason, I've read repeatedly that Dallas has been gashed by the run and that Baltimore wants to get Derrick Henry going, and this is like a good spot for him to get going given their scheme and the total and his usage. And then going down, and I'll stop after like one or two more here. I'll bring him up because I've seen Gordy, who's sharp, bring him up in chat, and I think Try brought it up in our bakery discussion. Pollard, who probably wouldn't even be on my radar, but he's off to a pretty good start. His usage seems really good. And then the last two I'll mention are DeAndre Swift. Jason, you mentioned him before. I also like the Chicago Bears defense, so I think it's nice to do a little correlation between your running back and your defense. And then the one that I haven't heard talked by anybody about, but I do feel like we're getting a little bit of interest in Brock Bowers, Devontae Adams, Gardner Minshew stacks. It's gross. It's really gross. But he's 5,500, and he got a ton of touches last week compared to Madison and Zamir White. So I'll stop there. But I'm bringing these guys up to point out that there's a host of pivots across a wide price range at running back that allows you to get off of Charbonnet, Mason, Akers builds. And I want to get your thoughts on those guys, James and Jason, on on any ones that you guys think I'm missing.
You want to go first, James?
No, you go for it. You go.
All right. So when we're talking about like the high end running backs first, this is the type of slate like when if I'm going to pay a premium for a position and I'm going to pivot, I want to make sure that they have the ability to hit a home run. Saquon is just one of those guys who's just very matchup proof. Like competitive game, he's getting a lot of runs, a lot of targets. They're down. He's going to get a lot more targets. I think Saquon is totally fine too. Speaking of what you were talking about, how a guy like Evan Silva has been saying Dallas has been getting gashed by the run. There's a really big misconception right now that New Orleans is like this overly stout run defense, when really they've just been blowing people the fuck out, and nobody's been able to really sustain the run because they can't. They have to throw the ball. So I think from a game theory perspective, especially if you're going to use a Derek Carr stack, I think it makes sense to maybe use him as a bring back. As a pivot off of Kamara, I don't really know. I think Kamara is a little, projected too well if you're making that direct pivot. In that mid-range, I love Jahmyr Gibbs. I'm with you. I also think that David Montgomery is very, very sneaky too. Arizona has been one of the worst run defenses in football, and they've been giving up some of the most explosive plays already through 2 weeks, and it's a holdover of last year. Detroit, as much as they like to get into shootouts, if they really can run the ball, they really want to. That's what they're going to do. And over on our site too, we have Detroit for the most implied rushing touchdowns in the entire slate, and it's actually not even close between them and San Francisco. So I think this is more about too, like with game environments, people think it's going to shoot out. I like pivoting to one of those two. Gibbs, I think, will get ownership. Montgomery definitely won't. Just in, you thinking that Detroit maybe runs like they always want to do. I kind of like pivoting there off of Jordan Mason. I don't know how much I want to go up. But yeah, Tony Pollard, I'm into that. Aaron Jones is a very interesting one too because he catches passes, and I think Houston's going to have success scoring. So I think him in the pass game really unlocks that. And yeah, man, the Zamir White chalk is like very funny to me. We have him almost at 10% owned on the site. I get that Carolina's been a sieve to running backs, but they got beat up by Alvin Kamara, and they also got beat up through the air by the Saints. They got beat up by J.K. Dobbins and also beat up through the air through the Chargers. I think you could beat them any way you want. Zamir White and Madison also haven't gotten that much work last week because they were down for a lot of that game in Baltimore until they came back. But I think that's a good leverage point also, the Vegas stacks. But if I'm pivoting at the low end, I'm probably going to DeAndre Swift. That's probably my favorite guy below 6K, not named Cam Akers. He's probably my favorite guy down there.
Yeah, so I wrote up a couple guys that you already mentioned, Pablo. Saquon Barkley, I think, is terrific. Just straight up pivot off of Alvin Kamara. And to your point, Jason, with the median difference, there is a median difference of 3 points, but when you're looking at a couple of different other metrics, there is basically no difference, right? Mm-hmm. The usage is considerably better for Saquon Barkley over Alvin Kamara, so he gets a pretty big edge on that. The expected fantasy points, Saquon Barkley's expected fantasy points on the season is 24.1. Alvin Kamara's is 24.77, and that includes a 4-touchdown game. So the aggregated projection between these guys, Saquon Barkley's aggregated projection between median, the utility score projection, which I pull in from Fantasy Life, and then the expected fantasy points. Saquon Barkley is at 20.98. Alvin Kamara is at 20.90.
Wow.
They're essentially the same play. And if you want to add in another person to that, Devon Achane is at 20.49. So those are kind of the three guys that have the best overall aggregated usage and projections. Obviously, Alvin Kamara is going to be probably 4 times as owned as Saquon Barkley and at least twice as owned as Achane. I don't see really much of a reason in anything but like really small field stuff not to consider swapping to either Barkley or Achane if you have Alvin Kamara. I think all three of them are basically the exact same play. So good call out on that. I think that Rams San Francisco game, I said it in the chat in the DFS Discord, but I don't think it's going to be a blowout. Matthew Stafford's a good quarterback, and Sean McVay's a really good coach. And yeah, they got routed last week, but shit happens when your all-star wide receiver goes down and then you're left with nothing and you game plan to have him available. They've had a week to game plan without him and Nakua, and I tend to think that good coaches figure out ways to move the ball one way or another, and I think the way they're likely going to do that is through Kyren Williams. They have rode him like a full workhorse back in the past. They like to use one running back. They like to give him targets. It would not surprise me if he had 19 carries and 7 targets in this game. At 7,100, I think that he's probably a really, really good play, but only in large field. I think there's a lot of risk on it. I think there is a risk that the Rams could just get blown out here. I think there's a risk that neither one of these teams wants to play fast, and that's going to limit opportunities. But I do think that in larger fields, Kyren Williams is an awesome play. Speaking to the Jordan Mason thing, actually. So you had mentioned, Pablo, Tony Pollard as a nice pivot. I think that both Tony Pollard and Aaron Jones are undervalued. These guys have really, really good usage. They have good expected fantasy points. They have good medians. And they're relatively cheap, right? They're in that 5,900 to 6K range, which is right there next to Jordan Mason. Jordan Mason's going to absorb so much ownership. Those guys are both going to be 5% owned. And I think they both make, if not pivots, I think they make terrific RB2 options. And then, everybody after that, I'm not sure that I have much interest in paying too far down on this slate. I like Akers, but I'm a bit concerned that Dameon Pierce is still there, unless Dameon Pierce gets ruled out. Dameon
Oh,
Pierce
he
gets
is out.
ruled out. Oh, he's out
He's
already?
out. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Then what the fuck are we even talking about? Cam Akers should just be locked in.
Yeah, the argument I've heard against Akers has been he was signed relatively recently, so they may not have that much trust in him. He lost a really bad fumble last week, and so there may be some lack of confidence in him for that regard too, between his newness to the team and his fumble, and then the other point just being that, you know, the Houston pass stacks are kind of attractive, whether you're using Nico, Tank Dell, or Diggs with Stroud, or whether you're just doing one of them on their own. Um, you know, it's you're they may just ride Akers, and he's so cheap that like at 4,700, he obviously needs very little to get there. But between his newness, his potential lack of trust that the coaches have in him, and then the strength of the passing game in Houston make him potentially slightly more fragile than he would seem. I tend to agree that it's priced in, but I'm just kind of bringing up the counterpoints to why people might not think he's great chalk.
Yeah, I got to tell you too, Pablo. The credence that also people are talking about is that Darren Agunbawale, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he actually outsnapped Akers pretty significantly. Granted, it was Akers' first game. He Akers had more touches, but as soon as he fumbled, like Agunbawale, whatever you fucking say his name, he took most of the snaps and played most of those downs and he caught some passes too. So, granted, small sample size. Overall, do I think Akers is fine? Yes, but I I think it may be closer to like a 60-40, 50-50 split than most people want to admit. And at the prices, that's still okay, sure. But lock button, I don't know. I just don't think he's going to get the mix and volume here.
All right, I'm gonna come in with a little bit of logic against you guys since everybody wants to talk about these hypotheticals. Agumbawale had, you said that he significantly outsnapped him. He did not. He had 31% of the snaps. Cam Akers had 21%. Cam Akers had 32% of the rushing attempts. Agumbawale had 9%. Now, granted, Agumbawale is going to be the guy who typically is going to get more targets. He's typically going to run more routes. I totally agree with that. But when it comes to things that actually matter, inside the 5 attempts, Cam Akers had all of them. Agumbawale had none of them. It just, without Mixon and Pierce, I can't see a world in which Akers gets anything less than 65% of the workload here at 4,700 in an environment where we likely think that there's going to be points scored. He's an incredible play. Now, if you want to say that Houston has a good passing attack and that it's attractive or whatever, sure, fine. I think that that's a separate concept to Cam Akers being a very good play, though. Like, if you have interest in Houston and think that they're going to score, I think you should be looking to find exposure to guys who are cheap and have good volume in a game for a team that you think is going to score a lot, and that's just Cam Akers. I will also say that Tank Dell at 15% owned is of magnitudes a worse play than Cam Akers at 4,700. I would go as far as to say that I would prefer to do something like Stroud plus Akers plus Collins rather than Stroud plus Dell plus Collins.
Yeah, I think on Dell, because I talked about him on Bakery a little bit, and I sort of want to counter a little bit of what I said because I tend to agree with you, James. I like Dell more if he's sneaky. Like at Dell being like 15+%, there's very good reasons to worry about his role.
I mean, he's been fucking bad this year. He's been bad.
Yeah,
this year.
and there's there's logical reasons to think about that, right? Who's the guy? God damn. He's a fairly known guy in the field. He does perception.
Yeah, Matt Harmon. Yeah.
But Mark Harmon had a little video he did on Dell being fragile this week, and his point, you guys can go on X and see it, but his point was that, hey, look, like number one, he had a really bad injury last year, like a really bad injury. Okay, like, it wasn't like a small injury. He was like fucked up. Number two, I didn't even remember this. I had to Google it this morning because I thought he was confused and he was thinking about somebody else. Um, he was shot this offseason. He was shot. Like he was literally shot on April 27th. Now it was apparently a minor wound, but like, and then number three, they brought in Diggs. So now the counter to that is like by the end of last year, I pointed out in Bakery, he was up in the mid to high sixes and low sevens in price because he was smoking teams, but that was pre-injury, pre-Diggs, pre-getting shot in the offseason. So it's a long way of saying that, yes, I think he's relatively underpriced in I think, an attractive game, but I'm less excited about it at ownership. I think there's reasons to poke holes in it, and at ownership, I don't know that I love it.
Yeah, I'm not. There's no fucking way I'm playing Tank Dell. So I'm sorry, I'm not. I especially at 15% owned, like Tank Dell. It was one thing when he was a focal point of the offense, but now he's wide receiver 3. He's coming back from major injury. All of those points you just made, and he's still expensive. I mean, he's priced like wide receiver 2, and his usage is like borderline wide receiver 3. It's not even like well supplemented wide receiver 3. That there's another person that was brought up on the Bakery that I think is really interesting in kind of that same price range. I'm gonna list off some numbers here, okay? This guy has an 89% route participation, 22% of the targets, an ADOT of 25.3, and 40% of the air yards, and is getting 33% of the end zone targets. Name this player.
He's a wide receiver.
He's a wide receiver.
And he's in Tank Dell's price range?
He is...
Or is he in Cam Akers' price range?
Hold on. Oh, I was just looking at him. No, I'm not. Yeah, he's in Tank Dell's price range.
Can you repeat the stats?
Yeah. 89% of the routes, 22% of the targets, 73% catchable targets, an ADOT of 25, 40% of the air yards, and 33% of the end zone targets.
I think I know who it is. Or I have a guess. Who is it? Well, I don't know if it's...
I only have two guesses.
He's a little more expensive than Tank, so it may not qualify within his price range, but his usage has been fantastic, and I said he's going to have an explosion game, which is Jameson Williams.
No, I love Jameson Williams. Do you have a guess, Jason?
Yeah, I have two guys in my mind. One is JSN on Seattle, and the other one I was going to guess was...
That was my second guess,
Jerry
by the way.
Jeudy.
The other one was who?
Jerry Jeudy.
No, you guys are wrong. It's Alec Pierce.
Oh,
tried mentioned him.
Yeah, Alec Pierce. He has basically the exact same stat lines as Calvin Ridley for over $1,000 less. Like if you put those
Tank Dell, you mean?
No. I mean he has basically the exact same stat lines as Calvin Ridley, who is a $6,000 wide receiver.
Oh, okay.
Alec Pierce is $4,800. Like Alec Pierce, 89% of the routes, Calvin Ridley, 92%. Alec Pierce, 22% of the targets, Calvin Ridley, 24. 25 ADOT versus 24. 40% versus 60% air yards. Alec Pierce even has more end zone usage and more red zone usage than Calvin Ridley. And you're getting him at 4,800. And like, I certainly understand that people are like generally skeptical of that. But like, Pierce has been really good, and to have the thing that kind of sells me on this, and yes, I recognize that Downs is back, and like it's gonna hurt Pierce a little bit, but I think that with how good Pierce has been, and to have an ADOT of 25 and have 73% of your targets be catchable is fucking insane. Like that speaks to Anthony Richardson being able to throw the deep ball like a madman, that's going to continue to be Pierce's role. Like Downs is more of kind of like a short tree kind of guy more. Like he's not running the same routes that Alec Pierce is. I think that Pierce is going to continue to maintain that role. And he's just too cheap for how good his usage has been. So I think that he's really, really interesting here as well.
Can I shift gears to game script, like sort of game script usage pivots, and I want to get your thoughts. And I also just want to point out other ways to use games and the way they're going to be used. And I'll just go from highest to lowest total for games that are going to be used heavily from an ownership standpoint. And James and Jason, get your thoughts on which of these approaches to using those games would be more or less exciting to you than the others. Can I do that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so highest total, Arizona, Detroit. Honestly, I've been trying to build Kyler stacks. It's hard to double him with Marvin and McBride. So I think just doubling him will be unique. I also think it's hard to hypercorrelate that game because while it's really attractive, all of the pieces are expensive. So I just think hypercorrelating that game, and I want to get your thoughts on singling or doubling Kyler. He does run. I do think he's one of the quarterbacks in my book that I've always been okay doing skinny stacks with. Given positional scarcity, if I had to pick, I would probably pick McBride just because I don't love the tight ends this week. And if I'm going to use my quarterback with an elite tight end, I'm going to use that bullet there. I don't like the thought of using Goff on the other side. Maybe I'm overreacting to last week because I did have a Goff team and I haven't seen Goff blow up. But I'll just mention that that's also an approach. I think Goff stacks will be basically unowned, and they actually are the team with the higher total. So that's the first one. Saints, Eagles. We talked about one way of doing this, which is using Barkley opposite Carr stacks, and instead of Devontae Smith. I am curious to get your guys' thoughts on using Devontae Smith and Barkley and doing a little mini game stack with a double between Carr, Olave, Shaheed. There are ways to build Barkley and Devontae Smith. I tend to think that would be a smaller field approach, but I don't hate it. And also, I'll just point out that I don't think Carr is going to be unowned. I think there's just too much interest in him given his price, and being given Shaheed and Olave are so easy to double him with, or you can even use Kamara if you want. But I still do think Jalen Hurts stacks are going to be significantly more owned than Carr stacks. So I think just using Carr instead of Hurts will make you a little bit different. I'll do two more and then I'll let you guys weigh in. Dallas, Baltimore. I don't know that there's a ton of different ways to use this game than are otherwise going to be used. I don't have a lot of interest in Dak stacks. I think you could do that. Most people are going to use Lamar, either skinny Lamar or even naked. I think probably the most obvious way of using a Baltimore player we've talked about, which is just Henry, again, as a pivot off sort of the 3 cheap running back build, which will be more of a cash approach. But maybe I'm missing ways of using that game that are more creative than I'm seeing. And then the last one I do think is interesting, which is Minnesota, Houston. What are different ways you can get creative with that game? I think there's a number of ways. You can use stacks with or without Akers. Probably without Akers would make more sense. And then I think you could go opposite. You could use Darnold and J Jeff. Sheets love J Jeff again. He is like one of the best, if not the best receiver in the league. I do wonder a little bit if he did get banged up last week. It seems all week long, it's based on beat reports and everything else. It seems like JJF is fine, but it's just worth mentioning he did leave last week's game, and that'll probably lower his ownership. But I think you can use Stroud stacks, which will be not owned instead of Akers. You can use Darnold opposite him. I mentioned projecting really well from a value standpoint at a weak tight end position. And James, to your point on sort of catchers, right? You got your catcher with your 1-2 batter. I don't know if somebody can mute themselves. And then, but I think there's, yeah. Anyway, I think there's a number of ways you can use that game instead of just using Cam Akers or, which will be the main way people use that game. Even if you want to use Aaron Jones across that, like you guys mentioned, I think he's a sort of sneaky strong play. So I'll stop there, but I just want to get your thoughts on using those on other ways that you can. And by the way, if there's other chalky games, I think those are the chalkiest games, and that's why I'm bringing up other ways of using players in those games. Then will be the more conventional approach. But what do you guys think about those approaches? And you know what? I'll mention one more, which is Charbonnet. Instead of using Charbonnet, using Geno Stacks or using JSN to get a little piece of Seattle, given I don't think JSN is going to be that owned, and he's looked pretty used so far. I'll stop there.
Jason, you go ahead, and then I'll kick in.
Cool, you got it. So for the Arizona game, from a scheme perspective, I think Kyler Murray is going to have all the opportunities in the world to run. Like I'm in complete agreement with you. Detroit is definitely going to man up. They're definitely going to do that. They're going to try to get after him. They're going to get him outside the pocket. The one thing about that game, too, is I actually don't have much interest in stacking it at all from using a quarterback perspective. If I was going to use Kyler, I would pair him with McBride. Another scheme thing here, the way that Detroit plays defense and their man-to-man is they actually like to bracket coverage to one side of the field, and even though they're in a man-to-man, they will put, whether it's a safety or a linebacker, on whoever's in the slot. And Arizona likes to run McBride a lot out of the slot. They like to run Dortch too. So if I was going to stack that game, I'm probably going there. I like to attack that game, honestly, through Detroit's running backs. Highest touchdown expectation on the slate in regards to rushing TDs. I think that their price points make sense and pivot off of other people. If I'm attacking that game, I really want to do it through the Detroit running backs. And sure, you could bring an Arizona bring back, but I don't know how much I want to spend on those quarterbacks. The Dallas and Baltimore game, I think I'm a little higher on that game than you are. Reason being, these are two teams right now that have very explosive offenses when they're in the right conditions. The way that Dallas is playing defense this year, everybody thought that they were going to come in and be like a very, press man coverage team because that's what Zimmer has done in the past. Actually been quite the opposite. They're sitting in a lot more of a zone. They'll throw out some cover one and they'll throw out some cover four. And I think what you're going to see, because they are blitzing a lot too, I'm going to double check their blitz rates right now. Oh, actually, no, I am wrong. The Cowboys are not really blitzing much at all. So I kind of like that Mark Andrews is very underpriced in this game. I think you could stack him with Lamar. And I think Dallas is going to have success scoring. I think they're going to be able to move the ball. I think they're going to look a lot better than last week, just based upon what Baltimore is doing schematically, too. I don't want to stack Dak. I think it's expensive to go to him and CD, but I do have interest in Lamar because I think he's going to get pushed this game a lot. And when Lamar gets pushed, we've seen him really break slates, but he's really the only quarterback I think I want to pay up for. Derrick Henry, I get the love, but I also I don't like buying into guys where they need to score twice in order to hit a ceiling. Like, could he have one of these great, rushing games? Sure. But I don't really want to buy into the fact that Dallas is just a sieve against the run. I think it's too early to really say that. Kamara just kind of worked them, and they shut down Cleveland pretty much on the ground. So I don't know how much I want to buy into that, but I have a lot of interest in Lamar. And what was the last game you mentioned, Pablo?
Houston, Minnesota.
So I'm really into stacking this game a lot from both sides, and it's really because I think both teams are very, very good at what the other team is going to give them. Sam Darnold, we've seen him now, where he's in play action sets, he's phenomenal. This year he fucking looks like Joe Montana out there. Obviously, do we think he's that good? No, but I just think JJ is just such an elite receiver. I don't care what coverage he's in. He's just too good to win any matchup. I think the Texans secondary is not very good at all. I think they looked good because they went up against Caleb Williams, but As James mentioned before, Alec Pierce, he tore them the fuck up. Anthony Richardson tore them up through the air. I like stacking that game a lot, and I think you can get unique in various ways. If you go Cam Akers, going Darnold and Justin Jefferson with Akers on the other side, I think that's a great way to get low owned if you're going to eat Akers and other chalk running backs. Conversely, I really like the idea of going with CJ Stroud, Nico Collins, and then even if you want to throw Cam Akers in there, like James said, just to capture as much offense as you can, you bring it back with Aaron Jones or you bring it back with Justin Jefferson. I like that a lot. I'm probably going to use Aaron Jones as a main one-off pivot, but I really like the idea of stacking that game in total. I prefer Stroud doubles, and I don't really want to double Darnold. I mean, maybe if you want to go, Jefferson and Naylor, you can. It feels thin to me, but I really like the idea of using Darnold and Jefferson if you're going to use Akers in a lineup.
Good thoughts, good notes. So I kind of think that there's a lot of opportunities here to overstack a lot of different games. Houston, Minnesota, to your point, Pablo, a lot of people are going to be on the Houston side. Not near as many people are going to be on the Minnesota side. And Minnesota side is cheaper, all things considered. Like, you can go Darnold with Jefferson and Naylor, and then bring it back with Collins. And, that's easy. Or you can do what Jason just said and go with that stack and bring back with Akers on the other side, eat a whole bunch of ownership while still being with a unique way to build. It's also worth noting that in terms of passing touchdown expectation, the team with the second highest passing touchdown projection is Minnesota at 1.55. Houston is at the top at 1.58. So those two teams combined for the highest passing touchdown projection of any game on the slate. You can overstack that and feel good about it. You could go with Darnold with Jefferson and Naylor and then bring it back with, say, Collins and Akers or Collins and Dell if you feel like playing a bad wide receiver. You can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. The New Orleans and Philly game, you can overstack the hell out of that one too. And you can stack from both sides. And again, the side that's going to be lesser owned in terms of projection is going to be the Philadelphia side. And you can get Jalen Hurts probably at less ownership than you can get on Derek Carr. And pair him with Devontae Smith and with Dallas Goedert, and then bring it back with Rashid Shaheed and one of either Olave or Kamara. There's a lot of scoring opportunities in that game as well. The one that I'm kind of not as stoked on is Detroit, Arizona. And I don't know if it's because I haven't bought into Marvin Harrison Jr. yet. I don't know if it's because Sam Laporta has been so terrible for Detroit and Amon-Ra St. Brown has been generally underwhelming, but that total feels really, really high at 51.5. I think that I mostly agree. The running game for Detroit is more what I'm interested in, which is kind of funny because I haven't talked about Gibbs literally at all, but they have the highest rushing touchdown expectation, 1.57. So I think that game is probably, if I was a betting man, I would take the under on the total at 51.5. I just don't think that it's going to get there. I could certainly be wrong. It kind of all depends on Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr. If they continue to be an elite duo and you think that Marvin Harrison Jr. can be basically like DeAndre Hopkins, then Kyler is going to be terrific. So that game I'm kind of lower on. I think that there are not that many spots here that I feel like leveraging from I think this game is going to go off perspective, but there are a lot of games that I feel like leveraging from, I think that there's going to be a lot of ownership in these games and you can be leveraging it in different ways. That Rams San Francisco game, I think that there's going to be a lot of ownership on the San Francisco side and basically no ownership on the Rams side. So even just introducing some of the Rams side into your San Francisco stacks, like Brock Purdy at 5% owned plus DeMarcus Robinson at 5% owned on the other side, that's going to be plenty. Or you can use Kyren Williams on the other side and say, oh, the Rams are going to get off to a little bit of a lead to start, and then San Francisco is going to be playing from behind, yada, 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 right? Or you use Jordan Mason and Kyron Williams against each other and assume that's going to be a low-scoring game where both sides just want to run the ball. I think that's a really interesting way to go about it as well. But the overall concept here and the thing that I think I want to leave people with and have them thinking about is there's a lot of ownership on only a handful of teams, but that does not mean that you need to fade those teams. It means you need to be smart about the way that you're stacking them. There's nothing wrong with going with a New Orleans stack, utilizing Brandon Ayuk as a one-off, so long as you're smart about the way that you're building it. If you do that and you bring it back with Kyron Williams instead of using Alvin Kamara, that's all the relative value that you need, and you still build in good relative value and a good secondary stack with Kyron Williams and Brandon Ayuk, right? So, like, try to think about things like that rather than saying, oh, this is a high-owned player, I can't really have him. Yes, you can. There's a lot of ownership on a lot of really, really good plays this week. You should not be fading it just because it's high owned. You should be looking for ways to use it in ways that the field is not utilizing it, so you can pass them when things go right.
Let me ask you guys one more question, and I have to jump here in a minute. I don't know that we need to go to cheap receivers this week because we have Cam Akers, because we have DeAndre Swift, because we have Aaron Jones, because we have Zach Charbonnet, because we have Jordan Mason, because we have Brandon Ayuk. But if you do want to get to some of the pricier guys, like if you decide to pay up a quarterback, which I don't think most of us will do, I'm not seeing a tremendous amount of valuable cheap receivers, and I want to just get your guys' thoughts on a few of them that stick out either from an ownership standpoint or from a sheet standpoint. And the three I'll bring up that stick out from the sheets and from ownership are Elijah Moore is getting steamed. He's 3,600. Njoku's out. It's a gross game. Everybody hates Deshaun Watson. Nobody wants to use anybody with him. But sheets have him as like the only receiver aside from Vel on Denver with a decent 2x, 3x, 4x below like 3.8K. So that's one. Two is Jawan Jennings, 4,100. I don't know that he's looking owned, but I don't know that I totally believe it outside of cash, because I think people are going to be much more likely to play Mason and or Ayuk, and I don't think they're going to want to force three San Franciscos. And then the only other one I guess is Odunze just, has kind of flopped so far. He's 4,200. Keenan Allen's out again. James or Jason, just want to get your thoughts on those. And if you want to include Val as a $3,400 punt unowned, I guess you could. To me, he's just too off the radar for small field for me. If I'm going to go down there, I'm probably playing either Moore, Juwan Jennings, or Odunze. I will point out one of the things that's nice about Moore is you can do a mini with him and Malik Neighbors opposite each other. And Malik Neighbors, just because of usage, even in a gross game, we saw it last week, he still got there just because of his usage. Does profile in sheets as like a pretty strong play. He's like top 10 2x 3x.
I'll go first this time, Jason.
Cool, you got it.
I wrote in the thoughts and notes. I don't know who Devon Bell is, but his usage was really, really good in the 1 week that he played.
Talked about him on the bakery, by the way.
Yeah. I think that he's interesting. Agree that he's a little bit too far off the radar. I very likely will not use him. I guess I'll preface as well and say I think it's very, very unlikely that I pay down at wide receiver this week. I just that mid range of that 6K group of wide receivers is where your money is going to be made. You have basically no reason to pay down, but if you need to, another name that I think is interesting, like I see the Elijah Moore thing. He's getting a little bit of ownership. I think that his usage is okay. His projection is okay. But like I don't want to be tied to this game, really. And cheap wide receivers that like what's Elijah Moore's actual ceiling, It's something like 4 receptions for 76 yards and a touchdown or something. I don't see a way for him to really win you GPPs. But a guy who I think is really interesting that no one is talking about is Quentin Johnson for the Chargers. If Justin Herbert plays, because there's some concern that he's not going to play, they had a really good usage plan for Quentin Johnson last week, and even in week 1, like his usage was not terrible. But last week he had 32% of the targets, a 32% targets per route run, an ADOT of 12, 50% of the air yards, 100% of the end zone targets. Like, he was used really, really well and had 22 fantasy points. And Joshua Palmer played that game and only ran 68% of the route, or 64% of the routes, and Lad McConkey only ran 68. Like, they're making an effort to get Quentin Johnson as the wide receiver 1 for this team. And if Herbert plays, I'd be interested in Quentin Johnson, who I think at the worst with this role should be somewhere in the 55 to 6K range. Like, I don't see a reason why, if he continues to have this role, he should be drastically cheaper than somebody like, I don't know, Jameson Williams, right? Like, I don't see too much of a reason to think that he's that much worse of a player. So he would probably be the cheapest that I would go. I don't see myself going cheaper than 4,500. I think that Quentin Johnson and Alec Pierce are kind of the cheapest guys that I'd go with.
Yeah, I agree with Quentin Johnson, especially too when you look at him in the research sheets. James, his role is awesome. I know we have him for a really good projection too. The one guy that I wanted to point out down here, and I know you brought up Devon Valley, so I won't say him. This is more of a, he's been getting some really good opportunity. The matchup that he's in, I think, is actually a little bit favorable for him. So I'm really excited to see maybe what he does with it. And I think you can make a nice little game stack out of this. And that's with Josh Reynolds. Josh Reynolds, 8 out of 12. He's got 27% of the air yards in Denver. He's been seeing 18% of the targets. He's going up against Tampa Bay, and I just don't really respect their secondary too much. They play very soft, and, if they man up, like, it's not really anything to write home about. They have a lot of injuries on that side. For a guy at 4,400, so 5 targets last week, had a long of 49, so 8 targets the week prior. I think this is the worst defense that the Broncos are going to see this year in the early part of the year. And I like Josh Reynolds at 4,400 as a salary saver. I don't want to prioritize it. Like, I don't think I'm going to go down there, but if I was, he's an option along with Quentin Johnson. And I like that on the backside of that, you could also make a mini game stack with Chris Godwin as somebody who you maybe want to pivot to. Denver, I know you probably saw this, James. Denver is like leading the league in blitzing and borderline leading the league in man-to-man coverage. I'm not usually a guy who really cares about one-on-one, receiver versus quarterback matchups, but Pat Surtain is going to be glued to Mike Evans like all fucking game long. I like the way they're using Godwin. They're using him in that Cooper Kupp role. That OC from LA is there now, using him in similar capacity. If Denver's going to man up Chris Godwin, I like the prospects of him as a pivot receiver. And his usage has been very, very good to start the year. So that's the only guys down there I wanted to mention. Not safe by any means. It's very volatile. But if I do feel the need to go down there, if I'm not clicking Quentin Johnson's name or Alec Pierce's, I'm probably clicking Josh Reynolds.
Jason, one more question, and then I'm going to jump, guys. As a resident secret Giants fan, in denial of your Giants fandom, what about Neighbors so far? His usage, not in an exciting game, but I'm seeing him fairly owned and projecting for good value.
Yeah, so first off, not a Giants fan, never will be. Born and raised Denver Broncos fan, even though I've never lived a day in my life in Colorado, but that's okay. I get why people are going there, but to me it feels a little silly, and I'm going to sound very different from last week. Daniel Jones sucks. Like, he's not really good, and he's going up against a defense that is very, very good. Like if the Browns didn't have Deshaun Watson and they had a better quarterback, they would probably be on a lot of like Super Bowl futures tickets and whatnot. I think their defense is very legit. I just don't see a need to really go there if he's going to be owned. And at 6,400, like when you look at the other guys in his range, like, yeah, I could play Chris Godwin, who's a little bit more owned in probably an easier spot. I could play DK Metcalf in an easier spot. Olave's in a much better game environment. Ayuk's right there too. I just don't think you need to go there. And I think you're banking on him getting that many targets and we're confident in Daniel Jones really delivering. I'm personally not. I'm not going to be going to Neighbors. If he makes like one of my MME, sure, but I'm not forcing him in at all.
I will just say that I think that Malik Neighbors is a baller. That
Me too.
He's gonna continue to just have like massive usage. But Daniel Jones has not been able to maintain a wide receiver one on that team his entire career. And I am willing to bet for now that he will not be able to maintain a wide receiver one with Malik Neighbors. So I think the price is still right at 6,400 to take a shot. I don't mind him in basically any format. I mean, he's going to carry a little bit of ownership. I don't think he'll be 30% owned like he was last week. But I'm concerned that Daniel Jones being fucking awful at his job is going to rear its ugly head sooner rather than later. So I'm mostly out on him, but he's one of those guys in that mid 6K range that I do think is going to make or break this slate.
All right, guys, listen, I'm gonna hop off. My parting words is more a promise to myself, which is force the hard decisions. Just decide where you think the best leverage points are. Make some choices. Even if you're playing a bunch of lineups, make hard decisions. Don't. And the other thing I'll say is this: don't be overconfident in NFL chalk. Like, we've seen a lot of times when NFL chalk fails, and I think a lot of the chalk this week is not, it's kind of like more pricing driven and just feels like an easy click. I think it's really easy just not to play the 3 cheap running back build this week, and you're automatically going to be different than probably half the field. And I understand you might be giving up median projection by doing that because Akers, Charbonnet, and Mason project so well across the industry. So you have to just be willing to understand that those are median projections, and there's a number of ways that the alternative builds have a higher ceiling. And just focus on ceiling and focus on the reality that medians are medians, and you don't win GPPs with medians. So those are my parting thoughts.
Jason, you got any closing thoughts here?
No, yeah, my only closing thought is too, and it's going to be a little different than probably what Pablo said, but I agree with him totally, is if you have a very strong conviction one way or another, if there's something that you see that you really want to exploit and you think that you have an edge on, it's still early enough in the season where we're still guessing at some things. So if you have some conviction, follow it. The other thing I might want to add is I also think, to Pablo's point about pivoting off of the 3 cheap running back chalk, I also think you could play that same style of build and you could just pivot off of a cheap running back. I know I talked about him, quite a bit, and I know you like Aaron Jones, but like going to DeAndre Swift or Aaron Jones in lieu of, Jordan Mason or Charbonnet is automatically going to get you a little bit different. I don't even think you need to really change the roster construction as much this week to get different because we have great pivots. So that's the only thoughts I wanted to really leave everybody with.
Good ones. I will. My closing thought is going to be that I think that this slate kind of encompasses what NFL is about, where we have really, really good options in terms of individual players, and people are not going to be looking to maximize the correlation around them. And even those that are going to maximize correlation around them are going to eat too much chalk around those correlations. And that's kind of like a lot of words to say that the chalk is really, really good, but people are going to use it the wrong way. So when you're building your lineups, try to think hard about, why am I utilizing this piece of chalk? Why am I playing Jordan Mason? What else could I be doing with Jordan Mason around him to maximize my use of him? How's the field going to use him? And take all of those things into account in how you build out the rest of your lineup. I think that this week, weeks like this and weeks like last week, really the good players end up winning. And so I hope that it's our turn this week.
Hoping so. I got some high hopes, man. I'm really excited for this week.
Yep. Let's bring home some trophies. All right, boys. That was a good one. I'll get this loaded
Thanks,
up.
fellas.
And then
Good luck.
Talk to you guys a little bit later.
Good luck, everybody. Later.
All right. Bye.